Join us on our Discord, the Greater Mandala. For access, sign up to the Order of Fire's mailing list.
All right, this is Jack Donovan, and you are listening to or watching PH2T3R, Pater, the Journal of Solar Culture. And I'm here with my co-host, C.B. Robertson, who is joining us remotely. He's traveling. Of course, he's an author of many fine books, which you can find in the show notes on his website. And obviously today we are here to talk about Plato's Republic, Book 5. I would say before we start, maybe it's Plato's most feminist part of the book. Although I guess I haven't made it the whole way through in this reading yet, so maybe there's more feminist stuff. But I don't think so. And we can talk about that. But why don't you, before we go any further, why don't you give your summary of it, Chris?
Well, sure. So I feel like Book 5 is the point at which it becomes the easiest, at least thus far in the book, to lose track of the context, to forget why we began this, despite concluding in Book 4 with this reminder that we were searching for justice in the individual. That was the point of this whole city. We have this kind of interruption from Adeimantus, which is supported by Thrasymachus, of all people, who we sort of discover was still here and listening to this whole thing. And they basically, Socrates feels like the discussion has been concluded, that they found it. They found justice, and justice is this principle of everyone just doing their own thing. Everyone has their one job that they do well. And then Adeimantus says, there's this whole other dimension of the city you've forgotten, Socrates. And he has this very funny way of like arresting Socrates in his speech, very reminiscent of Book 1, where they arrest Socrates and Glaucon and drag him back to Cephalus's house for their party. He says, basically, there's this part that you've left out that you're like robbing us of, and we won't let you get away with it. And Socrates gives this very interesting kind of it's like it's almost daring the people to continue their request. He says, it's very dangerous to speak of things that you yourself are not certain of. And I might be leading you astray, and I might be leading myself astray. And it would be a worse, maybe even to accidentally kill someone than to lead people astray in ideas in this manner. But they say, no, you would be acquitted in court, and you'll be acquitted with us. Carry on the discussion about what is the place of women and children in the city, which we have avoided. And so we get into this discussion about women. Now, a lot had been made in previous chapters about the importance of different natures, and different people have different natures, and so people should have jobs according to their natures, whether you're a guardian or a tradesman or a day laborer or a ruler, a guardian. And he says, well, sure. And they take a moment to steel man. First, he advances the idea that, well, if women are to bear good children and be good, members of the city, they should be excellent as well. And so women should have basically the same education and the same kinds of jobs as men. And they take a moment to steel man a potential counter to his position, where he says, but people will say, well, women have a different nature than men. And didn't you previously, we don't even need to offer a counter argument. You yourself advance the principle that different natures should have different jobs. And do women not have a different nature than men? Clearly they do. Therefore, this is, nonsense. To which Socrates advances a very interesting kind of argument where he says, he uses the example of, I believe it was short-haired people versus long-haired people being cobblers. If short-haired people are cobblers, that doesn't mean that a long-haired person who has a different nature where hair is concerned could not be a cobbler because hair is not a pertinent nature to the craft of cobbling shoes. And so it is sort of implied that the female nature, the difference between a male nature and a female nature, is not relevant in terms of how they should be. It's not the relevant kind of nature in terms of how men and women might be educated, which is a funny argument to make because it seems very unpersuasive on its face, but it sort of brings back the whole question of different natures that was taken as a given before. And
Right.
this is why I think it's so important to not just read the Republic through, but to like with it's as if with every book you read, you have to go back and reread the previous ones because very often it feels like subsequent books undo the first books. The arguments provided by Socrates were basically he's basically teaching Adeimantus and Glaucon about making distinctions between, saying X and Y have different nature doesn't mean that difference in nature is necessarily relevant, which was one of the things that Socrates was trickily doing to tie Thrasymachus in knots in book 1.
Right.
So you see the sort of mechanism of equipping these young men with the tools of argumentation in this process. But they advance through the argument that women should be, given the same education and the same training. And they even go so far as to say they should be exercising naked with the men in the gymnasium. And people will say this is quite ridiculous. But there's this funny line that he throws in where he says, people will look at this as ridiculous, but people used to look at just men exercising naked in the gymnasium as ridiculous until we discovered some, generations ago that it was actually superior. It was better to let everything show. And so now
can I stop you? That was, I forgot about that part.
Yeah.
But I was like, that is a really interesting little window into the rationale for that. Because, obviously, in the way that we would say women exercising naked today would be like a little bit strange. We would also say men exercising naked would be a little bit strange.
Yeah.
That would not really go over. And listening to them make their argument, just kind of as an aside there, of like, oh, well, back when we decided that this is how that works. I'm like, that is really kind of a fascinating window into something that we don't really understand very well at all.
Well, and it's a very clever, funny. It's so hard to read Plato without laughing. At every page, it's like you're reading an inside joke, because he was appealing to the ridiculousness, and many characters do in many places say, but we wouldn't do X, would we? No, that would be ridiculous. So therefore we do this other thing. And here he's introducing this idea that you shouldn't just reject a thing because it seems ridiculous. Right. You should think it through. And yet that's what they themselves have been doing in many other places. And so again, this is, if you assume that Plato is being careless and is being thoughtless, the book becomes just kind of incoherent and nonsensical. But if you remember the dubiousness of book 1 and the recognition of the dubiousness of the arguments, which the characters treated the arguments from book 1 with, and remember, like, maybe we're seeing more of that, because again, Socrates began book 5 saying, I'm not sure about the conclusion of this. I could be leading you astray, perhaps. He's priming the audience in some way to be perhaps on their guard a little bit against his own arguments. And at the same time, he is giving the form, and I think actually the Platonic form, of the structure of counter arguments to positions that they themselves are making in this book. So we get through the women. We say it would be, we shouldn't just dismiss this position on the apparent ridiculousness of, women and not just regular women, but older women who are fat and ugly. He takes a moment to describe that.
Yeah.
like the energetic old men who are also fat and ugly, but are nevertheless, working out at the gym. And say, we're training them in excellence, so of course they should be excellent in this manner. And they go on to describe a kind of eugenics program as well, about how we're going to have to breed our next generations very carefully, through particular ceremonies will control marriage very well. But if there is a serious theme in here, I feel like it comes out more towards the end, and there's a section where they sort of move away from men and women, and they talk more about the enslavement of Greeks, and shall we permit our city to enslave other Hellenes, other Greeks, or would that be unseemly? And there's a transition where they're talking about taking armor from the dead and stuff. And the emergent theme is the juxtaposition between the parts and the whole. And women are, of course, going to be a part of the city. So you don't want to separate the women from the men if the city is going to be a totality, a singular unit that is working in harmony. And the Ademata's bringing up the question of women is almost like taking the metaphor too seriously, and it's almost like forgetting the entire purpose of the metaphor. But Socrates sort of brings it back around when he brings it back to Hellenes and the enslavement of other Greeks, and it actually perhaps becomes a segue beyond just the individual for which we were discussing this whole subject in the first place, because one of the questions about the just man that was being brought up in book 1 in the argument with Thrasymachus is, do just men or unjust men get along with others better? And so cooperation with the whole, and you can see potentially, a segue into, maybe this metaphor isn't just a metaphor. It is like the just city we have built is clearly a metaphor. This is clearly ridiculous, but the principle of unity with the whole, in respect to the individual unified with himself, bringing all his different Freudian drives or impulses in harmony with each other rather than fighting with yourself. That's the most obvious theme. But there's the Neoplatonist school, which I don't personally subscribe to, but it's a fairly big school in philosophy, takes a step further at a sort of metaphysical level, of like unity with the universe. And you might see the sort of foreground to the Stoic concept of the logos here as well.
Cool. Well, as you said, the city, it's glad we got to a point where we realized it was they were having dinner. Maybe someone brought in some cocaine. They got one of those cocaine discussions where it's just like, and then we're gonna do this, and then we're gonna do this, and then we're gonna do this, and it just has to, everything kind of makes sense together, but in a crazy way. And that's kind of how it feels with the city in terms of their treatment of women. And you said that the argument for including women and not, because this characteristic isn't necessarily relevant to the others. You said it wasn't persuasive, but actually, I mean, it persuaded a lot of people. That's basically the argument for feminism.
Well, it's
like women are like,
it's a funny argument for feminism, though, because he at one point says we shall expect all the same things of women as of men, with the understanding that women are weaker and inferior to men. So,
but like they will do the same. Well, but the thing is, I think a feminist would have argued that. Let's say, okay, women are weaker than men on average, but not at the individual level necessarily.
Sure.
Usually they still are, but okay, well, you can have a guy who's 5'5" and a chick who's like 5'10".
Yeah.
And there's some big girls out there who can do some things. You never saw Game of Thrones, but there was this woman who just desperately wanted to be a knight, basically the whole way through, and she was terrifying and like whatever, and she just typical like tomboy kind of character, and so yeah, are there women who can be fierce and do those things and do masculine jobs, yes, and really that's the argument that got women into the military. Clearly, there are different physical standards, but if we want equality, we have to let them do the same jobs, and they can do many parts of the same job very well, or as better than men.
Yeah, they bring it back to sheepdogs. They say, they speak to one of the people there, and they say, you have sheepdogs. Do you separate the male sheepdogs into one category and keep the female sheepdogs apart because the female sheepdogs bear and the male sheepdogs mount? And the guy says, no, that would be ridiculous.
Right.
And so he says, so as it will be with our city and our noble puppy guardians.
Yeah. But of course, the reality of that in real is that seems good on paper, and it seemed reasonable, to a lot of people. Yeah. Especially dads with daughters. Especially dads with daughters and no sons. That are like, well, my girl can do anything your boy can do, and there's that thing, and they want that to happen. So and I understand it. I mean, obviously you have a kid and you want it to do the best, whatever it's good at, you want it to do the best at it, right? And so don't get in the way of my daughter having an opportunity. I can see a lot of people thinking that way. And then what happens is a lot of those cases, I mean, there are rare cases where they live up to every little detail of what they should be doing. And then there are a lot more cases, you hear nightmare stories from guys in the military. It'll never come out of in a press release because that's not the line. Yeah. But all these guys who are overseas and deployed, certain women magically get pregnant the second they get deployed, or once they get there, or they get there and these dudes haven't seen another woman for months, and she becomes, I've heard, becoming queen of the platoon, basically, or queen of the group, where dudes just do things for her. They just take care of her. I mean, the natural dynamic of men and women is not really considered in the argument. It's
this is the way of men. This is you wrote about this, and that the presence of women changes the dynamic. It changes the relationship between men and men in the presence of a woman. It adds this, and here we go back. This is the joy of reading the Republic, is he offers all the arguments you need to refute the ridiculousness of the conclusion within the book itself. If we're talking about the whole, and the well-being and the health of the whole of perhaps the military unit, that's all you need. We're not talking about the individual potential of the female soldier. We're talking perhaps she could be G.I. Jane, it could freaking happen. There are women who are very competitive in a variety of sports that they probably could do that better than 95% of men. Yes. That doesn't mean that they would not have, on the whole, and again, speaking generally about the form and the likelihood of these things over time, a negative, degrading effect on the functionality of the unit. Funnily enough, the military has actually done tests on this, and they have found consistently that all male units outcompete not just female units, but also mixed units. That could just be a physicality thing. It could be a psychology thing. It could be a group dynamic thing. My guess would actually probably be not physicality and more group dynamic.
Yeah.
So the framework of arguing from the whole, sort of precludes women from being in the military, I think. Now, that doesn't mean that women should not pursue virtue and excellence within the context of their own nature, which might not be the difference between short hair and long hair. You know, it might be more comparable to, you know, the difference between bearing and mounting. And you can listen to any number of, you know, biologists talking about the energy difference required in not just, you know, bearing a child is not just, you know, oh, one day I pop a baby out of my uterus. It's, you know, 8 months of, you know, mood changes and fatigue and nausea and, you know, difficulty. And then another.
Have you had any experience with this at all?
and then another year after that. And the emotional difference is dramatic. Both the women I happen to be talking to today, in fact, after they had their children, their tolerance for violence and gore in movies dropped to barely above zero. You know, dropped dramatically. They were like totally, like, one of them was very into kind of like horror stuff, like kind of gothic-y stuff. After having a kid, no, can't do that anymore, you know. And these changes are normal and natural and good within the context of bearing and raising children. You know, perhaps Plato's, you know, the argued ideal of women not knowing who their own children are might solve that problem, which is one of the things promoted or offered. I won't say promoted. It's one of the conclusions they arrive at. It's whither the argument goes, there we shall follow, as they say. Yeah. You know, perhaps that would solve it, but you might make a sort of argument similar to what these guys have been saying. It's like, wouldn't you expect a mother who has had a child, but then can't be connected to that child, to, you know, lose interest in other things and to become erratic and mentally unhealthy?
Probably a Democrat.
The modern Democratic Party doesn't strike me as the Platonic guardian ideal.
No. But the idea being obviously the idea being there is a nature of women, and as you said, there's all kinds of hormonal things and whatever, and it's like the idea that you're just going to pop a child out and forget about it doesn't always work that way.
No.
You know, even when they want it to. I mean, even women who give up their kids for adoption, or like obviously abortion's a thing in which that's kind of a similar thing. Yeah. But obviously, if you had a child and actually seen it, because it came out of you, like you know, like I mean, that's some life-changing psychology that I don't think that women ever forget.
Right.
You know, I mean, that's going to stick with them. You know, like and you know, the natural process is that they're supposed to care about that thing, and pretending that that's not there, I think, is you know, folly.
To take a minor tangent, I've also heard arguments that when women, the instinct to have children is much stronger in women than men. But if a woman who is healthy and has this instinct can't end up having a child of her own, there's a tendency to adopt a kind of proxy child. And in the healthiest instances, those are like pets or plants. But where it gets really dysfunctional, I think, is when that enters the domain of politics and they start taking on projects or foreign populations as sort of alternative children to express their love and maternal instinct toward. And also
they try to mother the whole world.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And there is a mothering instinct that is within the nature of women, to speak in the Platonic context here. The essential nature of women as opposed to the essential nature of men. That is different than the father instinct. I also want to do another tangent because Daniel Levy says there's too many cases where female police officers almost get themselves or others unalived. I want a guy who looks like Jack riding along in my squad car.
I do kind of look like a cop, especially before I had a beard. Then I really look like a cop. The Irish comes out, and all of a sudden,
yeah. There's been this whole discussion about would you rather run into a man or a bear in the woods. The question could also be asked, I don't know what the alternative would be, but the bear alternative would be being pulled over by a female cop.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Like would you rather run into a bear or be pulled over by a female cop? The framing. Maybe unfair to female police officers, but not less unfair than the male frame.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, to their credit, I mean, I would actually say that like female police officers, as much as I wouldn't want to interact with one, there are so many situations that involve women that they're probably better suited to handle.
Oh yeah,
like a lot of domestic situations and whatever. You don't necessarily want them in certain kinds of situations, but a situation where it's just women talking to women, they're probably better at doing that than some scary dude doing it.
There could be an argument to be made that like women shouldn't be in the military, or at least certainly not on the front line, the active duty side. But perhaps they could be cops. Perhaps there are currently, and presumably they do a decent job most of the time, and half the times that cops are going awry and not doing a very good job, they're men anyways.
Right.
So perhaps those two roles are different, but
yeah, I think so. But
Matthew Seneca says, having worked in corrections in a male facility, having women officers can make things dicey.
I don't know how that's real. And that wasn't a real thing until maybe 2000 or something like that, maybe a little earlier than that. But the idea that females work in male prisons seems like the worst possible idea, and vice versa. I mean, to be honest, if you want to say a job for women to be in that role, I think you should probably have women working in women's prisons because for the same reasons. Basically the same reasons.
It reminds me. Did you ever read Gary Larson, the Far Side cartoons?
I'm familiar. I can kind of picture it in my head, but it's been a long time.
They were like single panel comics. There wasn't like three panels. It was always just like a single thing. And he had one that was it was just a Bob's trampoline store next to and separated by a 3-foot fence from Fred's alligator zoo. And it was just a funny, what could possibly go wrong kind of
right.
And it's what putting, as you say, male cops in a female correction facility or female cops in a male correctional facility kind of. It's a Far Side cartoon. Come on,
Yeah, what's going to happen? Yeah, exactly. It's so obvious what's going to go wrong that you have to not believe your lying eyes to see anything different.
It's clearly ridiculous, and Plato might say, and he'd be right to say, you shouldn't just say, "Oh, that's ridiculous," and dismiss it out of hand.
Right.
But you, in this case, it's not hard to justify why it's ridiculous. And I think so long as you can explain this is ridiculous because men and women have this biological drive, and it's going to, as Matthew Seneca so politely put it, can make things dicey.
Yeah, at least dicey. And we've seen it happens in the news all the time. You see, there's female prison guard had sex with 20 male inmates, or is pregnant, has had 2 of their babies, or obviously I'm sure there's plenty of men abusing women in those facilities too, because it's a power thing. Here, I have absolute power over you. How could that possibly be abused?
He has a follow-up comment. He says, on the other side of it, the most uncomfortable I ever was in uniform was when I had a shift at a female compound. Understandably.
Yeah, that seems like a bad, like, things you shouldn't see. My favorite, the movie I always refer to, which is like from the 80s or whatever, the cook, the thief, his wife and her lover. One of the lines in it is like this. It's about this gangster and the chef and whatever. But there's this the gangster's wife is like this beautiful, like, glamorous figure, and he comes to find her in the bathroom because he wants to know what she's doing, and she's like, men who visit ladies' toilets are asking to have their illusions broken. I'm like, that's like they shouldn't ruin that for don't ruin that for each other. Yeah, like that's keep those things separate. But I wanted to go, unless you have something else you want to jump to. I wanted to go to something that I saw. As we said, we had that whole cocaine-fueled nightmare of the city that they created, and I like to imagine it that way now. They're like, no, wait. They're just talking over each other, and but then we get to the part where he says, let me begin by reminding you that we found our way hither in search of justice and injustice, and that's where they kind of like bring the frame back. I'm like, hold on, like we've gone far enough down this weird little rabbit hole.
Yeah. And
then he says a few lines later, because they asked her, like, well, we couldn't even create the city anyway. Like, how would you do it? And this is an interesting question on a whole bunch of different levels. So
and Socrates has that line at the very beginning of Book 5 where he asks to be given permission to be like those ineffectual dreamers who assume that the thing they're asking for can be done and then goes about imagining it. Which is, I thought, another funny little addendum that he puts in before even the exploration goes on. So, right. And then that wraps around to this discussion where there's like, well, how would we even create this city? How would it, logistically, how would that happen? And I think that's a question I have for a lot of idealists. Before I get to the good part, because obviously I like idealism. I created a philosophy called solar idealism, right? But there's an internet problem that is created by dudes discussing things like this in this particular way. I had a dude email me the other day. He was saying that I should not dump on fascism and stuff, and I was like, you're retarded and I can't do with you. But he was, there are many reasons why you're wrong, but and he's like, I'm not even a fascist, I'm a Confucian monarchist. And I was like, wow, that is an internet nonsense personality. Basically, because dudes get down this rabbit hole of exactly what these guys are doing. Well, what is right, what is good, and they get down to this impossible thing that only they have actually have the definition of, because they've zoomed in on this thing that they've created, but it gives them this. They're committed to this ideal that it has no support anywhere, and cannot be created anywhere. And it's cool to think, as we're going to talk about, ideals are good and they're good, like a North Star, and they're a direction that you want to go in. But it also is kind of a disease of the mind where you get to the point where I'm creating this thing and I can't be satisfied with the world and how it is until we have Confucian monarchism. Right. Which is what Neoplatonists argue that Plato is doing. And we'll perhaps see signs of that in later books, but there's an argument, if some of the sort of YouTube analysts of Plato are to be believed. I believe this was a point Michael Segru brought up, that because the perfect state is not possible to achieve, there must be something wrong with reality itself. And this is the segue into the argument for the pure forms, which we'll get to in Book 7, or perhaps Book 6.
I thought you were going to jump to Gnostic Marxism. There's something wrong with reality.
It's related though. It's this. But your description of these guys who go down these rabbit holes and say, "Oh, I'm not a fascist. I'm a Confucian monarchist." It reminds, in the context of the Republic, where Socrates is talking to Glaucon and Adeimantus, it reminds me of the scene from this movie, Viggo Mortensen movie called Captain Fantastic. Have you seen it?
I don't think so.
There's this homeschooling guy who's raising his kids in the woods, and they're like crazy educated. They're super athletes. They're kind of antisocial in a weird kind of way because they're so in their own thing. But at one point, his son has just like, he's become initiated into manhood, and he did that by killing a deer with a knife. In the woods. He says, "You are now a man." And they're like this weird mix of like kind of sort of anarcho-primitivist, but also they've got some kind of leftist leanings, but they're in the woods living on their own. And at one point they're going out somewhere, and the kid, the 17-year-old boy, is like arguing with his dad, Viggo Mortensen. He's like, "I'm not a liberal, I'm a Maoist now." And the dad gives him this like, "That's nice, son," kind of look, but he says, "Okay, just bear in mind that the communists killed just as many people as the fascists ever did." Just he's not pushing back hard. He's just like, "Okay, bear that in mind, and maybe if we had more time, I might ask you some Socratic questions about why you're doing this." But he doesn't say, like, he doesn't rebuke his son. He doesn't just outright say, like, "That's retarded." You might say that to some rando on the internet who's trying to like tell you what you should or should not say about a bad political philosophy. But in speaking to people you care about in person, it's interesting to see that he doesn't, like Viggo Mortensen's father character, doesn't immediately push back. He just says, "Okay, here's something to think about." And my preferred reading of the Republic is that we're getting a lot of that that questioning dad energy, trying to not necessarily push back on some bad ideas about justice, because a lot of men might think it's better to follow Thrasymachus or Mao or Confucian monarchism, and or Mussolini, as the case may be, or Hitler, and be like, we'll do this radical thing that will be super cool and it's super metal because the stuff we're doing currently clearly doesn't work, so we'll do the opposite. And we're just getting things to think about, and a sort of not just injunction to think about it, but the world expanding experience of actually doing that work rather than just saying something edgy.
Right. And what happens is you get these guys who have these very idiosyncratic political views, but I think we've all been through that. I'm sure you have. I have. We've gone through different phases in life where you're like, "I found a new thing. This is the cool thing." And then you work out why. Maybe you have some life experience, or you just go deep enough down the rabbit hole to come out the other side, and that you're like, "Okay, well, this is why I don't." Someone questioned why I wrote that. Why I did that piece about Germanic paganism. That's the most popular video on our channel because it pissed a lot of people off. And it's not because I wanted to even take an aim at anybody. It was more like, okay, here's how I went into the rabbit hole, came out the other side. I was really into that, and here's where the problems that I found when I was in it. And that's what exploring philosophy really is, and going through different ideologies. So, I mean, it's a right thing for a father to say to a son like that, like, okay, especially for a very young man, like a young teenage boy, to be like, "I'm a Maoist now." Like, okay, that makes perfect sense to kind of give it some room. But it is a question, like, is this philosophy? Can you get there? I think is a realistic question for the real world. Now we talk about idealism. We're like, what do we like?
Yeah.
What are our ideals? If I had to rewake, if I had $1 billion and blank space, what would I do? But that actually never happens. So I mean, It does happen. I mean, America was the closest thing to it because you had new land. But really in history that mostly doesn't happen. And I always say to people who have big plans or whatever right now, I'm like, well, okay, well, what's your pathway? Like, show me your practical pathway. Like, yes, that would be not like people. There are a lot of people right now who say they're monarchists, and it's hard to argue like a well-installed monarchy over a long period of time is not a bad. It's worked for a while, but it's been pretty good for a lot of history. And but I'm like, who would you like to be king? Is the next statement.
One of my favorite political philosophers is actually describes himself as a monarchist or sometimes as a royalist, and that's Curtis Yarvin. But there's a big asterisk on his monarchism, which might disappoint the sort of average monarchist you find online, which is that he thinks we've actually had some really good monarchs in the United States. We've had, in his view, four. We've had four presidents who were functionally monarchs. There was George Washington, who was essentially a conservative coup against a much more liberal confederation, because the 1789 Constitution, that was not the beginning of what has become the United States. There was this initial 10 years of governance that was just an absolute travesty. And people forget about that. People don't know the first president of what we call America now was not George Washington. It was John Hanson. Who the hell was that? So George Washington was essentially a monarch. We had Andrew Jackson. Mm-hmm. We had, in Curtis Yarvin's view, Abraham Lincoln. And then we had FDR. And FDR kind of shut the door behind himself. So his view is like, if we could just get a functioning executive branch back, basically, and he calls that monarchism. He wants the monarch to have absolute power, but with accountability. He wants a CEO. A CEO of a company is essentially all powerful, but there's a board of directors that can fire him if he does a bad job.
Right.
And so, like, that model is kind of what we originally had in many ways. Now, the president wasn't, they were the executive, but they weren't coming up with the plans. That was more Congress. So in Yarvin's view, it's like maybe the president should actually be the ones who is passing laws, and the Congress is less like creating laws and more literally just there to check on how things are doing and get the president out if he's not doing a good job. It's like a different variation on the same thing, really. And it's not that radical. But it's, that's a mixed government is probably not what monarchists have in mind. So,
Yeah. I mean, it's like I said, it's hard to argue with that was a good system for certain areas, and there have been good monarchs in history and so forth. But like, how do you get there? Like, show me something you can do in my lifetime. I'm like, I don't see that. So I think bringing up practical concerns, if you're actually talking about statecraft and politics, I think is valid, because otherwise you're just being like, well, I made a fancy idea in my head and then there's nowhere to get there.
Right.
But at the same time, when we're talking about ideals and the ideal man, which is kind of what I want to circle around back to, because that's what I found a line in here that I really think encapsulates the whole argument for solar idealism, really, and what we're trying to do here. And because, we have these archetypes and we have this ideal of what a perfect man is. And we know that is not a real person. Because there is no practical concern involved. You're not trying to actually create a perfect man. Like, we're not doing a bionic man. Like, we have the technology, we can build it. We're not trying to make the perfect man.
Yeah.
We're trying to say what is the best way to behave as a man. What are the best attributes of man? What are the highest values of man? What are the highest virtues of man? And how can we be more like that, knowing that we will not ever be that?
Yeah. There's that Robert Heinlein quote about, a man should be able to change a diaper, plan an invasion, butcher a hog, and all this stuff. It's like there's actually literally no man in history who's been able to do all of those things. But if you can add more of those to your list of competencies, that's good. You know.
Sure. Yeah. I hate that quote. I'm always like,
I actually like it.
I'm like, specialization is actually how civilization works. It doesn't work without it.
That's the argument we see at the beginning of the Republic. You know, every man should be a total specialist, and that is how you maximize efficiency. But maybe that's not how you maximize virtue if man has a divided nature.
Yeah, and obviously we've discussed this, I think, in the last show. It's like, well, obviously, you're not a one-trick pony. Like, all I do is make shoes. That's all I care about is shoes. You know, like I can also like and enjoy other things and be good at other things, and that's good too. You know, but so basically they wrap it around the sentence that I really liked, that I think captures idealism. It's so perfect. Would a painter be any worse because, after having delineated with consummate art an ideal of a perfectly beautiful man, he was unable to show that any such man could ever have existed? And that's like all of it. That's the whole argument for idealism right there. It basically stands in the face of the actually guys who were like, well, he never really existed, or he wasn't like that, or like, there's nobody like that, so we should not try and be like that. That totally missed the point.
Yes,
and that's all the arguments against masculinity, about masculine idealism of any kind. They totally miss the point, and they just get stuck in the weeds and the details, and that's part of that kind of destructive, resentment-driven, Gnostic Marxism, take things apart thing that they're doing.
Maybe,
you know, but
maybe the most iconoclastic philosopher of the last 5 centuries was the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Just an absolute powerhouse skeptic, and he is the inventor of the is-ought dilemma, or the sometimes known as Hume's guillotine, which is you cannot derive an ought from an is. You can't get some kind of obligation or an ideal from a descriptor. So all of the actually crowd from Reddit, or all of the like people's history of X place or of X event, any kind of Howard Zinn style purely descriptive deconstruction of an idealized historical event, is attacking idealization through direct description. Right. And by approaching it purely descriptively, it destroys all possibility of an ought, of any kind of direction or ideal. And I feel like what we're doing, what Plato is sort of illustrating here with the brilliant example of an artist, I think, is if you begin with the aesthetics rather than with descriptions, if you begin with art rather than science, it solves all of the is-ought dilemma. I mean, you're not putting science away. You're not putting descriptors away. You're still constraining yourself within what exists and what you know of reality as far as you can know it. But you're not letting that descriptor prevent you from having an ideal because you're not beginning with the description.
Right. Whereas most people bring it just turns into gossip when it comes to great men and great men arguments and so forth. They're looking for some feature that you're like, well, did you know George Washington had a small dick? Or something that's just going to make him seem not
Slave's
like
teeth or something.
Yeah, or like he had bad teeth, or like he was mean to this lady once, or whatever. And by the way, I don't know that George Washington had a small dick. I just threw it out there because that's the kind of thing that they would say.
Yeah,
you know, like, hey, let's make this person that is on a pedestal, let's make it look like there's something wrong with them, and no one would want to be them.
Yeah,
and so it's just
yeah. I was just saying, pure description is. It tears down all differentiation. because from a purely descriptive angle, as Hume points out, there's no reason to prefer one thing to another thing. So it's
Right.
the gateway to the void.
Yes.
A pure descriptive skeptical approach to ideals that tears down ideals and oughts is the mouth of the dragon, we might say.
Absolutely. And so reading that quote, it took me back a little bit. Like, it took me a minute. I was like, that reminds me of something. And I'm like, I know I've quoted it before. And I just started typing into Google. I said, it just came to my mind, like, man in the ideal. What is that? Where does it come from? And Google actually gave me the pretty much right away what I wanted. And it's for this quote that I had read many years ago. To be fair, I've never actually read the whole thing of Moby Dick. I think I've tried a couple times, but I cited it, and I've used this thing before because it was really striking. And the characters actually don't matter to this statement. I had somebody today talk to me about it, and they got caught up in the characters when it doesn't matter. But basically, the idea is he's saying, like, I think he's seeing, and I don't know the exact context, but he's seeing a guy who's been really, who he admires clearly, and he thinks he's probably going to break, and so he writes this, and it's so good. Let's see. All right. Men may seem detestable as joint stock companies and nations. Knaves, fools, and murderers there may be. Men may have mean and meager faces, but man in the ideal is so noble and so sparkling, such a grand and glowing creature, that over any ignominious blemish in him all his fellows should run to throw their costliest robes. That immaculate manliness, we feel it within ourselves, so far within us, that it remains intact through all the outer character seem gone, bleeds with keenest anguish at the undraped spectacle of a valor-ruined man. Nor can piety itself, at such a shameful sight, completely stifle her upbraidings against the permitting stars. But this august dignity I treat of is not the dignity of kings and robes, but that abounding dignity which has no robed investiture. Thou shalt see it shining in the arm that wields a pick or drives a spike. That democratic dignity which on all hands radiates without end from God himself. Like, he's like bringing in the everyman. It's like not just one guy. It's not this great. It's like everybody. There's this part of it in all of us.
It's like the Platonic form of a man.
Yes. I'm like, oh, this is such good shit. Like, this thing is like why I started doing what I'm doing. Like that, I saw that, whatever it is, and I'm like, shit, yeah, costliest of robes. Let's we need to lift this up. And funny that you mentioned Andrew Jackson, because the full quote, I'm not going to read the full quote because it's like a whole nother paragraph of like 19th century English, but which is fantastic. But he's talking about, like how great, it basically some more great man theory stuff. And he actually says in here, let's see. Bear me out in, thou great democratic God, who didst not refuse the swart convict Bunyan, the pale poetic pearl, thou who didst close with doubly hammered leaves of finest gold the stumped and paupered arm of old Cervantes. Thou did pick up Andrew Jackson from the pebbles, who did hurl him down upon a war horse, who didst thunder him higher than a throne. And what's fascinating about that, I saw that, and I'm like, that gives you this window into history of like how they saw this guy at that time.
Yeah.
Like, as you were just talking about Andrew Jackson as a monarch, there is this one of America's most famous authors ever being like, basically God picked him up and threw him down at the sky and put him on a war horse. Like that's pretty wild. I mean, imagine the greatest writer of our time right now saying that about anyone.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the difference. Like that's what we've lost. Never forget what they've taken from us. That meme or whatever. But imagine, I mean, that's, like for men to believe in other men in that way, I think is something so rare. Now.
And to not allow the petty descriptive imperfections, especially the moral imperfections, get away from prevent you from recognizing the ideal that you see through those individuals.
Yeah.
As a kind of minor sidebar, I read Herman Melville, Moby Dick, probably 8 years ago, and it's just we're talking about Plato and we're talking about the Republic, but if you enjoy just excellent writing, it's so good. There was a line I remember reading that stuck out to me where Starbuck is accusing Ahab of being crazy for going after a dumb beast. It's like, this is revenge against a dumb beast is pure madness. And Ahab says, madness, hearken a little closer. And he paints the picture of being trapped inside a cell wall in a prison. And he says, I may not be able to punch through and strike the guard, but if I punch the wall itself, I can punch through the wall and hit the man through the wall. And whether the beast is the barrier or the agent is irrelevant. I sense the power behind this thing. And that's what I hate. And that's what I'm pursuing. And just the vividness of the description and the philosophy of agency and being, I mean, this is what we talk about with Nazi prison guards. It's like, how are they the actors or not, and does it even matter at a certain point? Like there's so much depth, it's so densely packed in that writing, and it's truly excellent. So maybe we'll get someone criticizing Herman Melville as a bad person for whatever reason, but
I'm sure. Well, I think his progeny is pretty far left.
Who cares?
Moby is Moby is like Herman Melville's like great grandson. He was a really big techno artist in like the 90s, and so anyway, but he was actually Herman Melville was like great grandson or something like that. But and was very heal the world kind of guy, It's I forget what I was going to go with that after that. But I was going to say when you talk about good writing, of the 2 emails that pissed me off that I've gotten this week, and I actually don't get emails that piss me off all the time. I don't want to make it sound like that happens because I really don't usually. And these were both from people who actually like my work. Like they weren't even like criticism. They were like people who were trying to help me in some way. But someone told me I should write at a. I've had a lot of people say this because this is the copywriting. I mean, you've been close to the copywriting industry. Like most people don't read above a 5th grade level, and so you have to write everything at like a 5th grade level. And I'm like, that's when I'm no longer a writer. That's just marketing. Like if I have to write everything, I know Hemingway, whatever, but that is not how I write, and that is not like this shit that we just wrote. That is not at a 5th grade level, but that's good. Are you
trying to? Are you like we're reading Plato?
Yeah.
We're reading Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic is not written at a 5th grade level, and he literally created the Western philosophical tradition.
Yeah.
Was he successful in his own time? I don't know. There's plenty of writers today who are extraordinary contributors to thought, to scientific advancement, to all kinds of fields, who have not reached a larger audience, who have not made a great deal of money, who may or may not wind up being like remembered by history or whatever. But if you want to advance culture in a positive direction, you can't let the low common denominator of popular opinion set a threshold, a ceiling for the quality of your work.
Yeah.
And sometimes,
the guy was basically telling me I should write more like Tate. Like your email, your emails should read more like Tate. And I was like, you don't understand what I'm doing. You know, like that's a different thing that's doing. And like, you know, it's not necessarily even bad all the time, you know, but it's not, but for what I'm doing, that is not.
Yeah. There's a place for that. And there is in a way, he's not wrong in that, in terms of popular success, Ayn Rand was.
You can influence so many more people, is what he was trying to say. He was trying to help.
Ayn Rand was way more successful than Ludwig von Mises, you know, financially, publicity-wise. There would have been no Ayn Rand without Ludwig von Mises.
Right.
You know, and Ludwig von Mises is the higher quality version of Ayn Rand. If you like Ayn Rand, but you think maybe she's not satisfying, you should check out, you know, Ludwig von Mises. You should also check out Nietzsche and her other influences, but it's mostly von Mises.
Yeah.
And there are criticisms of him too, but like in terms of great contributions of thought, you're not pursuing the highest ideal by writing at a 5th grade level.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and just not creating anything beautiful. I mean, like, there's beautiful things you can do with language, but you can't do them at a 5th grade level, because then you're having a, you know, like a Little Red Riding Hood level of writing. It's not gonna, that language can do more than that. You know, and obviously there are people who can write, you know, even, you know, much at a much higher level than I can. You know, I'm very much a popular writer in that sense, but you know, like I think that, you have to. Your lowest common denominator is what I thought as well. It's like, well, how can you complain that we have a dumb culture if they write at a 5th grade level and you write at a 4th grade level just to make sure that they understand?
Yeah.
Like, what happens when it has to go to 3rd grade? Like, you know, like that's how it happens. That's how we got here.
That's what TikTok is. That's what TikTok is. It's just undercutting and going for a slightly lower common denominator.
Absolutely.
It's funny because there's a level at which this is the entire discussion that they're addressing in the Republic. Mm-hmm. Is it better to be seen as just or as intelligent or as wise or as you know, to influential to reach a larger audience, or is it better to actually be wise and intelligent and influential, perhaps, or not? You know. Is it better to pursue power, or is it better to pursue virtue and excellence and justice of the sort that we are, you know, coming to some sort of understanding of, but maybe not there yet? And is it better to give a snappy, short, 1-sentence 5th grade level definition of justice, or is it better to take your time and explore it in some kind of depth, even at the risk of losing some people in literalism along the way?
I think, obviously that was the last discussion we had in our forums, which I'm really excited about. In the Order of Fire, we started a new chat system, and all of a sudden it's like we're back. Like all our guys are like talking like constantly. It's like super fun in there right now. And so like that's in the you know, the First Men, that's in our inner group, but it's really blown up recently. It's been great. But what I left it with today was there was this great little, I think it was a snap from 4chan. Was basically like, imagine being Nietzsche and writing that.
The fight against nihilism, and he like literally goes mad trying to come up with some solution to the greatest threat to the world, which is nihilism, and like dedicate your whole life to this, and then some edgy teenager comes along, and is like, I like Nietzsche because he was a nihilist, man.
And gives you an excuse to be a hedonist. Like that's not what he was doing.
Literally the opposite.
But, but one of our guys was like, it was like, isn't that all your greatest fear in philosophy is having someone like, totally not get it and totally misinterpret your work in 100 years? I'm like, it happens now. It happens all the time. Like,
I need to start making like keep philosophy boring T-shirts to keep the freaking edgelords and like the quick grabbers from feeling good about borrowing people that they didn't read.
That's kind of good. I like it.
It's funny. Just earlier today, Michael Millerman, who's I guess a fairly popular philosophy teacher on like Twitter or X,
right,
formerly called Twitter. He posted a video about Plato. Is he a communist or a fascist? And he had this funny line at the beginning. Is like most people who are trying to understand Plato are looking at him through a 20th century political lens that's totally inapplicable. And but the funny comment was like most people trying to interpret Plato actually never read him. Who have read it or think they read it, and the number of people who have strong opinions about these philosophers that they never bothered to explore or read is alarmingly high. I think the most irritating meme I've seen, which is like the Nietzsche one, but for me, or for Plato rather, is the Plato means broad in Greek, and they show that like the Chad face image of Plato, and he's like he once settled an argument by flexing, and it shows like one guy says, "But Plato, I think your argument," and it shows Plato flexing and being like, "Shut up, nerd," and it's like no one who has read a single paragraph of Plato could possibly believe Plato would address a ridiculous argument with a direct "shut up, be quiet," nerd. Like, no, he's the nerd.
Right.
He's the one who's making the ridiculous argument. It's the exact opposite.
Right.
Could not be more wrong. But anyways, yeah, it's that people trying to meme it, and not just memeing philosophy, memeing literally anything. Brings it down to a 5th grade level or maybe a 2nd grade level. Makes it more applicable to the public, but it ruins it. It doesn't just do the Einstein thing of simplifying it as much as possible. It goes beyond the Einstein's advice of but no simpler, and makes it far simpler than it actually can be reduced, and destroys the thing. And as you pursue that ideal of man in all of its intricate complexity and the full breadth and depth that entails, you can't simplify that down, beyond a certain.
You can only take it so far. And to the point of like, well, you can speak to 4th graders in 4th grade language, but then you level them up as you get older. If you start talking to adults like 4th grade languages,
right,
then you kind of deserve the world you've created.
Maybe this segues into another one of because Matthew Seneca has been commenting here. Speaking of something we said like 30 minutes ago, he said the wisdom there being, speaking of the Viggo Mortensen and his Maoist son line, he says the wisdom there being, if you fight them too hard, they'll dig in. If you help them realize the truth they're blind to, they will hopefully come around to a better view. I think that's the better way to speak to 4th graders than just trying to abuse their language in a way that brings you down to their level, condescending. Here the word condescending gets a little ambiguous, and there's kind of no way to speak to a 4th grader as an adult without condescending in some sense or another. Right. But there's one approach that definitely, lifts them up a level, and there's another way that brings yourself down a level. Mm-hmm. I think one of the most rewarding moments as a parent I've had ever was observing my daughter interacting with our hosts here. And at one point, someone used a word that she wasn't familiar with, and she says, to the host, what does this word mean in this context? And she's like not quite 6. So like the host is like, what does this mean in this context? Well, and then they explained it, but it's like when you speak to kids in a way that is, not just blowing over their heads, but which you're speaking to them as an adult, and you're treating them seriously, sometimes firmly, but still seriously, and saying, no, we're not doing that right now, and here's why, or whatever. It has the effect of bringing them up, and it's rewarding. It's tremendously rewarding to see that, and it puts the whole project of the Republic, which is in many ways a book about educating young men in particular, but perhaps young people more generally, in I think a different light. So that was my thought reading Seneca's Matthew. I want to call him Seneca because it's such a catchy name. Seneca also says the North Star isn't the goal, but it points the way, and we merely get as close as we can. Right. Exactly. And even if the North Star doesn't exist, even if the North Star isn't real in like in a Neoplatonist sense, we can sense the possibility of a North Star, or the idea of a North Star in an artistic sense can be enough,
It's like when you throw a punch, you're really supposed to be punching behind the person's head.
Exactly.
Like just something that you can't see, but like through and behind, which is kind of an odd example. It just popped into my head, but it's very similar to that.
It gets very Bruce Lee very quickly. I mean, because the whole Bruce Lee thing about, don't focus on the finger pointing towards the moon or you'll miss all the heavenly glory. That's idealism. Don't focus on the thing right in front of you necessarily if you're trying to pursue the ideal, or at least to perceive the ideal.
What's really happening. It reminds me of that's like the most Jedi thing in boxing. The most Jedi thing that I ever did in boxing was they have a ball that's suspended between the ceiling and the floor, or two things, whatever. And it's just this ball. Michael Baldrige has one, I think. To do it, I mean, you're punching the ball, but the ball's moving on this like elastic thing, and it's bouncing around or whatever. Yeah. And you really actually can't look at the ball. To actually do it, you have to be like, you punch where the ball's going to be. It's the most Jedi thing that boxers have to learn how to do. Like it's the idea of the ball is moving around. You have to feel where it's going to be.
It's like when Vic was having us throw rocks while walking in a circle. You can't focus on you have to be watching the ground, but you can't be focusing on the ground because you have to focus on the rock, but you're still watching the ground. The same kind of principle as far as perception goes. Matthew also says, it makes me want to raise my ability by how you both write, and I can feel the challenge at times, and it's wonderful. Excellent. That's good. Cool. And then he also adds, and when you want to create something new, sometimes you have to spend years in the desert losing people along the way until the new can take root and prosper.
For sure. Very biblical, but that's I feel that that's real. I mean, it happens to me.
I mean, Jesus wasn't the only guy who went alone into the desert for a while,
No.
Zarathustra went up on his mountain into the wilderness for a decade, and there are other examples.
No, absolutely, and I mean, it is true. I mean, you even say, we even see it with Order of Fire. Like we have like this, like there's people who stay and people who leave, and like we just slowly collect the people that really belong there, and then but like the people who maybe don't or for whatever reason leave. And sometimes people come back. I have one guy who's coming back today who left is coming back. I mean, so it's like but yeah, I mean, like when he said that, actually I'm like, oh, I feel that. It's been about 2 years, and I'm like okay, it takes a while. Cool. So, you have any other comments there?
No, just that's it for the live chat at the moment.
Okay.
But
Cool.
how's your feeling been of Plato's Republic as a whole? You know, chapter 5. I think book 5 it feels like a kind of turning point of sorts, where we're moving into a theme of unity with the whole. And it feels like the conversation we've gone a fair distance from book 1. You know, the argument with Thrasymachus about, is it better to be just or is it better to be unjust, the creation of the problem in book 2, where the ring of Gyges and the full explication of the stakes of being just versus being unjust in the most perfect form of each. And then, you know, we have the beginning of the creation of the city. Book 3 and book 4 are really building the city out. And then book 5, we have a sort of completion of the city with the introduction of women. And now we're beginning to look perhaps beyond the city. Like we've covered a lot of ground. And I've been passively asking people, you know, at work, random acquaintances, like, oh, yeah, have you ever read The Republic? And almost everybody says something to the effect of, like, I think I did a long time ago. And then when pressed, they're like, I read part of it. And like, my guess would be they were made to read part of book 7, the allegory of the cave.
Yeah, everybody knows the cave. That's what people know from like the Republic, for sure. Yeah, I mean, right. That's obviously what I'm most familiar with as well. I mean, I've read other parts of it before, but definitely, I mean, that's the one I've probably read several times, because that's what everyone refers to. You know, like when they refer to Plato, and it's the most used. It's you know, in the way that, you know, people pull like X number of things from George Orwell or whatever. That's what they pull and use it as example in literature and all that stuff is the myth of the cave. But obviously there's the myth of the sun that's in there as well, and you know, a few other things that I've dug into in the past. I
mean, my feeling is that like the cave is. I shouldn't talk about it too much because we haven't even got there yet. But like, it's good writing. But to me, like book 1 and 2 are like my favorite parts. And I think if I were to pick a third favorite, it would be book 10, which comes after all that. And there's some good writing in the middle for sure as well. You know, some kind of tedium you have to work through as well. But the people who've only read book 7 and who haven't read book 1 or 2, they're like missing not just the heart of the book, but the entire context of it.
They're just basically getting the metaphor, because the thing about the allegory of the cave or whatever is that it's a very visual metaphor that anyone can really understand. And when you talk about ideals and what's real and all that kind of stuff, I mean, obviously that's, you know, and it has a lot of contemporary, like it's easy to apply it. So you know, there's a lot of that, I think, there, and because it's visual. I mean, some of these conversations are not very visual at all. They're all logical, so that's a little harder to dig into and really take away. Even if you read it, you know, like unless you've read it like multiple times, like you, even if you've read it, you might not carry that with you in a year or two. You might lose a lot of that because it's you know, you're kind of in the weeds with them. Definitely, I mean, I definitely have, you know, the bigger sense of it being a conversation, you know, and who it's between. I think I understand more than, you know, I think in the past. I think before I've always read it in like in the print version, and you know, so the names just kind of become whatever. Like I'm not really like paying attention to that, like stuff like that. It's like I'm just like, what's the details? like give me the thing. I need to figure out what's actually being said here. But the idea of them being characters and having a conversation, I think, is more brought out for me in this reading. And obviously the bigger, as we're walking through it, the bigger concept, the context, as your daughter would say, you know, that's more apparent than it would be if you took any of the single parts out of context, which is what mostly people do.
Yeah. I'm going to go out of order here in the comments because Matthew Seneca says, I'm guilty of referencing the allegory of the cave today. There's nothing wrong with referencing the allegory of the cave at all. Like we were just talking about, Moby Dick and talking about a particularly poignant quote where the context and the subject kind of don't matter. I mean, they do matter within the story, but you don't need the context as to borrow from Thrasymachus, your job is not to it's the argument you need to refute, and it's the quote and the idea, and whether I'm being sincere or not in his case, or who a given quote or story might be referring to is not necessarily relevant if you want to employ a metaphor. My complaint, or it's not even a complaint, I was just kind of trying to get a survey of like, how familiar are people in the laity, in the world generally, with these ideas? And I was actually surprised by how many people have read at least that little bit. It was just surprising to me, I guess, in going back through it, that the part that was selected from the Republic was the allegory of the cave, when there are so many other, especially in books 1 and 2, I think, very, very powerful questions.
The ring I didn't know about before. Before you introduced me to the ring, I didn't whatever, I skimmed that part or whatever. I didn't really catch that when I was reading it years and years ago. But that's also very visual, powerful, and easy to use metaphor. And obviously they've used it in films, as we know, because it asks a lot of questions. Yeah.
Right. Lynx Mercury says, this has been a fun one. I'm all for naked gymnasiums.
Even with old ladies and old men. And I was going to joke that, if you go into any gym locker room, you can have that experience right now, because there's some old dude who has been naked for 30 minutes. That's. It's a joke because it's true.
There's this old Pepsi commercial of two guys, American guys, sitting on a beach, and they're watching these just hot babes walking out into the surf, and they're like, there's beaches in Spain where no one wears swimsuits, and they kind of think about it for a second, cheers each other, take a sip, and as their cokes are coming down, it shows it cuts to the upper body of this old grandma who's taking her bra off. It's showing her just from this part up. And as she bends over to take her pants off, you see the identical twin brothers of the guys on the beach in Spain, oh, and they're in America, there are beaches where they're not allowed to be naked. They all have to wear here's a drink. So there's some trade-offs to there.
That's funny. Yeah.
Matthew Seneca also says, sadly, I've seen the allegory used my phone is putting a heart in front of it, in a Gnostic context to explain the demiurge and the, quote, true reality. I think we talked about this a little bit in our Gnosticism episode. I don't remember exactly, but there's a huge crossover between the what we could call the Neoplatonist school, which is, like I said at the beginning of this, it's actually a fairly large school in philosophy, or at least a long tradition, and a somewhat respected one, and Gnosticism. They were in some ways perhaps the first Gnostics. You could make a case for Pythagoreans or something, I don't know. But yeah, Neoplatonism. The Venn diagram between Neoplatonism and Gnosticism is very, very heavily overlapped. So that's a common observation, and I think the question, the most important question, I think, for people who are reading the Republic to think about is Plato himself a Platonist in the conventional sense? Or is he maybe doing something else? And I think the problem with a lot of interpretations of Plato as Michael Millerman was pointing out, is that it's very easy to give a kind of superficial reading of him, and it's very easy to even maintain a degree of superficiality after you've seen through the first couple tricks that he pulls. Because I think most people, upon like watching a few videos like this about it, will be like, oh, okay, I get the, like, I went down to the Piraeus, like that catabasis is not just a, like, I walked down a trail. That has some symbolic meaning. So bam, there's layer one. But there's like a lot more layers to it than that. And then you start getting into like Straussianism. Maybe you get into Costin Alamario and his like super Straussianism, where he's like hiding behind the esotericism to present his real opinions as if they're ironic, but not really. And but it's shocking how
Not
many.
everyone is an internet troll, dude.
Yeah. At least he's writing under his
That's
real
you
name
seeing yourself. Yeah,
Yeah.
like.
But it's shocking how many otherwise like serious people are taking this extremely tricky book, this extremely playful book, where like almost every follow-up line, not every follow-up line, but like many, there are contradictions just from one line to the next in many places that are like that are funny, and they're taking this at basically face value or literalism. And perhaps there's a case to be made that Neoplatonism, or just Platonism as some people call it, is maybe guilty of some degree of that literalism.
Right.
So, but that's really a question for books 6 and 7, where we're talking about the truth itself and the Platonic forms and all that.
Yeah, I mean, we alluded to it earlier. I mean, like it's easy to see why the Gnostic thing would fall into that, because like what you're seeing is just the reflection on the wall. There's another world beyond this one that you can't see.
And for the audience,
get there is communism,
right? / fascism.
Yeah.
And I mean, Michael Segru sort of points this out, and I do still recommend people who are finding this interesting. It is worth listening to Segru, because he does a very good job of bringing up a lot of the themes in the story. But like I mentioned before, he's basically saying what Plato is doing when he points out what you were observing before. He's like, this city, this just city, such as it is like not practically possible. There's no way for this to actually come into being in the real world. Michael Segru says that's Plato's way of saying there's something wrong with reality. And that critique of the existence of the world as it is like the spiritual heart of Gnosticism. That's like what if you were to perhaps oversimplify Gnosticism, because there's a lot going on in Gnosticism. There's a lot of different kinds of Gnosticism. So you can't really even group them all together. But if there was like a single unifying theme of Gnosticism distilled down to a sentiment, it's the critique of reality. It's the critique of the material world, which is a very like audacious thing to do. To imagine that you know so much about how things ought to be that you know that the universe is wrong, and it would be a particularly interesting thing to put in the mouth of a philosopher whose primary claim to fame is that he claims not to know of what he speaks, and who is maybe concerned even about leading people astray with arguments that he himself is unsure of.
Right.
So Matthew Seneca has a few more comments. He says, it's hard enough to understand the language of Moby Dick, which by comparison was much more recent than Plato's writing. I still think Plato was clear but if you can get past the language of things like Moby Dick and other archaic language like that, like bits of the Iliad can be tricky too. And there are other great texts that are, can be kind of challenging.
Well, people wrote differently at different times. Like, I always say like the 19th century stuff, and this was true a little bit in the passage that I read from Moby Dick. They were not overly fond of periods in the 19th century.
Right.
There's a lot of semicolons and run-on sentences that go on forever. They were not in the Hemingway. They clearly did not have the Hemingway editor. They were not doing the fifth grade leading level. They're like, we're going to make a sentence that's a page long with a lot of clauses and colons and whatever. So that makes it tough to read, because you're the way you want to phrase it. Like it's hard to, like I was trying to read it aloud and it's like I'd have to really rehearse that to get it, like to nail it, because the places where you want to stop, it's leading you on still. There's still more.
Yeah. It's got a little bit of garden pathing, but the language is still great.
Absolutely.
He also says, you can't see it, but for $19.99 a week, I can teach you.
Yes.
Yeah. That's how real G's escaped the Matrix, right?
Exactly. Yeah, for $19.99, you can definitely there's so many. The thing is that there's so much of that. It's not just that. It's like that's the biggest one, which is is whatever, possibly not even evil, but so many. Just the amount of YouTube personalities and so forth that have like the secret truth is so, and are making a lot of money off of it.
One of the biggest new age marketing sensations of the last 3 decades was The Secret.
Yes,
the idea of secret or hidden, and here I'm trying not to be too speaking out of both sides of my mouth too intensely, because we're on the one hand condemning this idea of like, ooh, the secret knowledge, the real reality that's hidden behind the material reality, and on the other hand we're like, we're talking about what Strauss would call an esoteric reading of Plato, and here esoteric doesn't mean like magical, mystical. We mean esoteric as in it was written in an intentionally cryptic manner for a reason, and using the tools that Plato is providing in this educating book, we can maybe unwind some of this weird cryptic form, as he was sort of intending us to do with this Rubik's Cube of a frickin' book. And maybe appreciate the art of the puzzle as we go through that. Matthew also says, this bad reality made by a bad God, we need to transcend to good reality with good God. I think he's adding an addendum to our Gnostic thing. That's correct.
Right. Yeah, that's the deal.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that's book 5 and the women, and we didn't really talk too much about children except the eugenics part. But I hope that I hope this is making sense. I worry sometimes in talking about Plato, if we're going for an hour and a half, and it doesn't actually take an hour and a half to actually just read book 5 of the Republic. So hopefully this is providing some useful thoughts and contexts, and as Socrates might say, perhaps our interpretation of this is wrong. You can't necessarily, you shouldn't anyways, necessarily take our word for it. If you did, that would probably defeat the entire purpose of going through the Republic.
Right.
Because the point is to go through and to be, going along with the interlocutors and saying, right, yes, that follows, that's good. Wait, what was that? What did you just say? And Socrates, why, I mean that the young people should have horses so that they could be able to flee battle quickly. I guess that was part that he did talk about children. They should be observing battles.
Yes.
I'd forgotten
but
about
so they
that.
can't get hurt. Right. Yeah.
They'll have swift horses that are not war horses, but very fast. And
Yes.
lightweight.
But yeah, no, I think it's the thing is we're also talking about the bigger picture in society, in contemporary society as well, and how it fits into that. So it's not we're not just only deconstructing. Well, not deconstructing, please, but we're not only walking through Plato's Republic and talking about it, but we're also talking about the ideas themselves and how they fit into the bigger society. I went on a Melville tangent for like half hour. We're
breaking it down. We're not deconstructing in the postmodernist sense. We're deconstructing in the Heideggerian sense of the term, which is
exactly
breaking it down so that we can digest it.
Right.
Not so that we can destroy it.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. All right. Well, that's good. I think that we should probably wrap up there. But thank you guys for watching and commenting. As always, it's always good to have some feedback and some interesting discussions and thoughts come in from other guys. I asked today on our Discord, which you can join by joining the link. The more people were in there, the more conversations we're going to have. But it actually was there was some conversations happening today, going on about different aspects of this. And I actually asked how many people were following along. I think James Powell, he fell behind, but he's trying to catch up with us so he can join us again,
cool.
like on schedule. He's like, life happened a little bit, and I got behind. But we had a few guys who are following along in there, and a few guys that are following along in the First Men as well. And I think probably more than we know. So thank you guys for watching, following along, and hopefully, I don't think you can read Plato's Republic and then talk about it for an hour and not get something out of it. I mean, that would be kind of like, I don't know how you would actually manage to do that.
Yeah. It's one of those books that you can keep coming back to, dozens of times, and you'll keep getting different things out of it. Like I'd read Plato's Republic a couple of times before I discovered Greg Nage and read the Ancient Greek Hero, and reread the Iliad and the Odyssey after that. And then I don't remember what happened exactly, but something triggered. I saw something that triggered my memory of the Republic, and suddenly it was so clear how everyone was misinterpreting it because of Greg Nage's description of this Ainos mode, which I think I talked about in the previous show. And like going back and contrasting, Plato's view of Odysseus versus Socrates' view of Odysseus, what we see in like the Apology and all that. Like reading that book, The Ancient Greek Hero, completely changed my understanding of the Republic. But that is not the only book out there that will change your view of the Republic. There are like lots of, because so many books are directly or indirectly drawing on the Republic. Like if you've never read Lord of the Rings before, and you read Lord of the Rings and then you read the Republic, that will change your view of it. Or vice versa. Maybe reading the Republic changes your view of Lord of the Rings, and now you get to go back and reread a completely different story of Middle Earth the next time you revisit that story.
Wow. Imagine a world in which I sit down and read Lord of the Rings again. I can't even imagine the time, like setting aside the time to do that. I actually
watch the movies, as the case may be.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've watched the movies like a million times, but I saw them like as they came out every Christmas. I saw it, all three of them on Christmas Day, like in Los Angeles, I think, at the time is where I was living there when they came out. But yeah, no, it's yeah. Because I think I read Lord of the Rings. I'm pretty sure I was still living in my parents' house when I read that. Like that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what I would get out of it now. Like a lot of people who read it as adults have like this recall of like extreme detail, and I was just a kid trying to read a really advanced book. I was probably like 12, like 12, 14. These, I was trying to read all the hard books, and so you get a different. I'd get a much different picture now, but.
Yeah, it's just got it's got great language. It's got great references. There's a lot more songs in the books than there are in the movies, which is like not usual to see in books. But it was just, it's one example among many of, books that could change your reading of the Republic, or which could be changed by the Republic in turn. It's just a powerful paradigm shifting book. And I feel like those books are often the most worthwhile to read because of how much more interesting they make the world. And they build upon each other in a culture building way, I think. And I would say people should read The Republic, but there's a good chance they won't fully grasp it unless they have also read the Iliad and the Odyssey. And we've already heard, these characters in this, dialogue quoting Homer like verbatim at like every turn. They're like, as Homer said in this area, and they'll bring up Homer quotes even as they describe the need to censor him. Was there a Homer quote in book 5? I believe there's been a Homer quote in every book so far, multiple in most cases. And Homer so powerfully frames the dialogue. He provides the ideals that they are, seriously entertaining and challenging. And it's like, are these Homeric ideals really the good ideals? And maybe they aren't, but maybe they still are. Maybe we're steelmanning an argument against them, but they hold up against our criticisms. We'll see.
Yeah. Cool. All right, guys. Until next time. Obviously like and subscribe, all that shit. But like and subscribe, buy my shit. But anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Stay solar.
Stay solar.